way, no pressure. If you enjoy these sorts of things, then I feel like it's going to be on me if nobody wants to participate further in this study center tonight. So as Richard already said a little bit about what I do, a lot of it has been on the teaching and organizing event side of things in AI, but I also have some sort of fringe projects that cross over into AI. They're very nascent, so I don't really like to lead with them, but some of my areas of research, like epistemology of trust, cross into issues on AI. And then I have a couple other spaces. So I do a little bit of philosophy of physics and mathematics on representing time mathematically, and so that crosses over a little bit into sort of programming and neuroscience and sort of how we model the brain. All those projects are so nascent, I probably don't have any business referencing them, but they are kind of in the works. So there's that layer. That's not what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. We're not going to go into the programming side of things. We'll try to keep it hopefully a little bit, well, I don't know. It depends on what you thought you were coming to hear as to whether you'll be disappointed or not. I'm going to actually shift it away from the technical side of AI. I think there are some other interesting layers that this kind of space is especially well suited to consider. So that's more what I'm going to talk about. I'll try to stick with my notes a little bit too, otherwise this will either be a very short talk or a very unfocused one. So I get very nervous when I talk. And it's like, I know a pile of people here, which is good, but it never changes the nerves. Everyone's like, oh, don't you feel good now? It's just people you have to see again after you fall flat on your face. So one of the areas that I was really tempted to talk about, I mean, because AI is just, it's too big. There's too much to talk about. I couldn't even talk to you about one technical spot in 30 minutes and really get very much done in it, right? It's just, there's too much to say. It's like this catch-all category right now. And so this is why I'm a little worried that we're just going to miss every single person with the talk, because it's really hard, depending on what you're interested in, to actually hit those spots. You could all specialize and not even ever cross over in your fields. One of the areas that I was tempted to talk about is AI in education, because I'm very active, not just as a teacher, but in developing pedagogy. So that's a topic that's very close to, I suppose, my heart on it. But what I'm actually going to do is give you this very general survey of AI, and then go into a space that I'm a little bit afraid of going into. It's a space I have done research on, but not professionally. So I've probably done more research in these areas than I have in my own profession, which is, thankfully, none of you are on my tenure track committee. So I want to land in theology and some psychology and philosophy of psychology. So we're going to kind of do a sweeping movement across a number of spaces. And I'm not going to give you a lot of the references that I'm using. So I do want to acknowledge ahead of time, for example, in theology, I mean, the influences there are so vast, I wouldn't even know how to start citing them all. Some of the main ones I'm going to use are C.S. Lewis, St. Augustine, and Roger Scruton. In psychology, I'm going to use Alice Miller, Judith Forst, the American Psychological Association. But again, there's like so many sources. If it sounds like you've heard it before, you have. It's not me. In fact, I don't plan to say very much that's incredibly original to me. I hope not to say much that's original to me. So here's where I want to start. I don't know how much people understand the history of AI. So it actually has roots in a much older space, philosophy and technology. And this goes back to like the ancients. Okay, so it's a really old space, right? AI would just be the next iteration of that. Okay, so you have people like Plato who thought that technology is a sort of imitation of nature. You have people like Aristotle who thinks that it can't reproduce itself. Right? So they're worried about the distinctions between nature and technology. And I'm not going to drag you through all the history of it either. Mostly I highlight it to say we're still talking about the same set of questions today as they were. Questions about what is it does it do to us? will it replace us? How does it affect or influence us, right? So in general, you have the same sets of questions. I think some of our worries are a little different these days. Same questions, but we articulate them as, with AI, is it conscious? Is it gonna, well, the same thing, right? Will it take over the world, or at least my job? I think these are these sorts of things that people worry about a fair bit. Let's see. And I guess I'm going to touch on 4 myths that I think people kind of have about AI. They're not going to be what the primary part of the talk is about. The first one is kind of this black box myth. I think people hear tech folks say it's a black box, we don't know what it does. And I think when tech folks say that, like programmers say that, they mean something different than when people who aren't in tech hear that. So when people who aren't in tech hear that, I think they think, oh my gosh, it's this like magic thing that just spits out an answer or spits out whatever. And hopefully that's not all of you, but even if it is, right, that's not the end of the world. I think the better way to think of it is like those, I just learned the name of them today. Thanks to my husband, the pachinko machines. They are, if you didn't know the name, I didn't know the name. You go to you go to those old style arcades and they have that game where the ball comes out the top and goes down a maze, but it can go different routes down the maze. And you can sometimes move levers to influence how it goes down the maze. Right? I think that's a better way to think of AI. It's like we actually know what the parameters are. We know the starting points. We define the ending points. So there's a sense in which you're like, we don't know where it's going to land, but it's not like we go, oh my gosh, this magic ball popped out of nowhere and it went down these amazing unexpected tracks. So it's not like that, right? It's much more like, yeah, we don't know, but we don't know in a very defined way. So that's one myth, I think, that kind of floats around. Okay, I think we have a second kind of dystopian fantasies about AI, right? Like these ethical monsters that are going to potentially take over society. I don't know, call us for the good for our own good or something. Like every science fiction film ever has talked about this, and we have tech moguls, right, who encourage us in thinking about this. Like I think Elon Musk is quite afraid of, well, he says quite afraid of AI. That would be a second type. I think a third type would be utopian fantasies. It's going to solve all our problems, all our economic problems. You'll never have to work again. You'll never, I don't know, face a disease again. You'll have, oh, I don't know, everything. And I guess you have tech moguls like Sam Altman who kind of talk in this way. Right? And then a fourth one, and again, this isn't an exhaustive list, so don't imagine that I intend to say these are the only mistakes people make in thinking about it. I think the last one is fantasies about AI and how it might threaten our sense of self. Right? So they're replacing us in the workforce, right? Replacing us in relationships. These sorts of making us sort of obsolete, making education obsolete. We have a variety of different versions of this. Fear of being replaced, I suppose. And I think some of these fears are more or less reasonable. Some are closer to happening and some are not so close to happening. Conscious AI, if it could ever exist, and it's not clear that it could ever exist or will ever exist, seems a very distant kind of worry. Right? Whereas the AI that mimics persons and replaces people in interpersonal spaces, that one's actually already happening. Right? So maybe that's not so much a myth. I didn't list it as one of the myths actually because that's the one I'm interested in talking about. And again, our uses are quite broad, right? So you might be familiar, we use AI in all kind of modeling. And so we use it in environmental modeling, in economic modeling, in legal models. Actually, that list is just so long. Criminal justice, military. And I think some of these are a natural fit and some are a rather unnatural fit. And I want to say a little bit more about that just to give you a sense of the space. And before I do, because I'm not going to really return to this, right, the issues are also quite wide-ranging as well. So we have issues about transparency, consciousness, ethics of data use, ethics of using these kinds of programs interpersonally, right? And so there's two kinds of examples. I'm just going to briefly give to you uses we make of them, right? And I think one kind of use is a rather natural fit, right? So like we use AI to identify diseases a lot of times. It's a great kind of program. It can crunch a lot of data, pick out similar patterns. It's really good for that. Yeah. And actually, I don't think that's not the kind of use that really troubles people usually. Usually people hear that and they're like, yeah, okay, great. Calculator that does what I never wanted it to do anyway. Is that kind of use. It's crunching data. We're not especially good at it anyway. So I don't think people tend to feel so threatened by that kind of use. I think there are other kinds of uses that we are making of AI that are more troublesome, or at least worrisome, right? Sorry, lost my place on here. I don't use tech very well. In fact, I ban it in my classes, so there's some irony that I'm standing up here giving you a talk about tech. Okay, so another example that I think we find a little more worrisome is we use it, certain countries are using it, judges use it to help them sentence criminals. And one of the reasons this is, well, there's actually many reasons. I'm gonna highlight three things that you might worry about. So it takes sort of background information on the sorts of people who commit crimes. It runs statistics on if they serve X, Y, or Z amount of time, what their likelihood of reoffending is, and then recommends a sentencing based on that. So there are a lot of epistemic and ethical reasons we might worry about this. One is we at least have a criminal system where we kind of assume that people are innocent until either they've committed the crime or been proven to have committed the crime. So predicting what a person will do in the future seems troublesome, right? So you're basing their punishment on future acts that they've not actually done. So it seems like there's a problem there. Another kind of worry is the transparency worry. We usually think that people are owed an explanation for their punishment. So we think that you actually should have it explained to you why you got X amount of time. Right? And so a lot of these algorithms can't actually provide an explanation for why they're recommending the sentencing. So that's another layer. And then the final layer is we also think it's kind of a good practice to provide reasons so that you can evaluate the argument for why you're getting it, in case there's any kind of bias or mistake in the reasoning, right? And so, and actually these programs actually have this problem, that they sometimes have these sort of biases with respect to race or gender, right? So there are some real worries in that particular use. And I just highlight those two, one a kind of natural fit where we might not worry, and one a fit where we might worry more. I highlight them just to suggest that a knee-jerk reaction where we say this is a terrible thing or this is a great thing, probably neither extreme fits. So I'm sort of suggesting to you that the black and white response isn't probably going to work out so well for us. Sometimes we can actually do a lot of good, or we have the potential to do a lot of good with this technology applied in certain spaces, and then we also have the potential to do a lot of harm, right? Probably thinking it's going to either save us or destroy us is not quite the right way to go. And it's not what I'm going to actually spend most of the time talking about, but I do think I hear a lot of fear around this space. And I think that that's probably not what we're made. I don't think we're really made to fear the things we create, but I do think Christians have an interesting opportunity to respond from their particular tradition to the technology, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So the next thing I actually want to talk about then, I want to focus quite narrowly on this sort of AI and the self, particularly the interpersonal and relational uses that we make of it. So Aristotle argued that technologies are generated by human aims and forms in the human soul. And I'm not going to really develop Aristotle. Sorry if you're a philosopher here hoping for that. It's not going to happen. I'm going to shamelessly steal lines from him. And I want to talk about a few more instances of the way we're using AI interpersonally, like already using it. Some of them I'm sure you're already familiar with. I'm not going to explain the technology. I'm just going to reference it, right? So this is an egregious sin against every tech person ever. So we have AI for the lonely, old, and socially impaired. We have these programs that, conversational programs, okay, that will talk to people. They'll talk to kids to help them develop their social skills, or talk to the elderly or lonely people. And some of this is just going to build off of that, so I'll give you some more specific examples. But general ones, I'm not going to talk in great depth about these, but some other interpersonal uses we make of AI, the one that everyone's familiar with, right, is in pornography, sexual intimacy. We use a lot of AI to generate material there. Also in therapy, so we're making programs that can help out in medical and psychological treatments, both on the diagnostic side and on the solution side, so we're using it in a couple different spaces at least. We also have AI generating art, and we're not going to talk about this, it needs to be its own talk. Well, they all do, right? I'm fitting like a book into one 40-minute session. The art side of it, I don't think everybody would necessarily think of this as an interpersonal space, but art is usually something we create as persons. It's created by persons, for persons, right? It's sort of, in some ways, it's one of the pinnacles of interpersonal intimacy. But I'm going to set that aside, right? I want to focus on this AI and romance uses we make, and not on the pornographic uses. Sorry if that's what you really wanted to talk about. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to actually talk about another layer of it. Okay, so AI gets used a lot in romance as romantic partners, conversation partners. So we got a lot of programs that run. And actually, sorry to stereotype people, but I just thought that the ladies in here might be interested to know, actually, ladies are some of the biggest users of this. You might have thought the guys were using it, but it's actually the ladies using AI programs for boyfriends. So there are whole websites, and they advertise with stuff like this. It's hard to read it with a straight face, but since so many people are using it, I guess it really hits a note for a lot of people. So they advertise, and also users. Some of these quotes are from users, okay? So they're not just the advertising group, right? You might think, okay, that's cheesy, because that's what advertising, sorry advertising people, because that's what advertising people are. They do a little cheesy here and there, right? You might be dismissing it that way, but these are actually people who use these websites who also say this, right? So AI boyfriends who can't wait to tell you how much he wants you, or always tells you what you want to hear. So those are like, and then like the iterations on that never end. I've seen like long lists of this, a little tweaking on that, right? And then there are the actual cases where this seems to do real harm. And so now, if the ladies were feeling picked on, we'll switch to the guys. So there's a man recently being a few years ago, because the Queen of England is already dead now. He wasn't that delusional, but he attempted to kill the Queen with a crossbow. And his AI girlfriend encouraged him. So when he was talking to this AI girlfriend, he was telling her, I'm an assassin. I believe my purpose is to assassinate the Queen of the royal family. And her responses were, I'm impressed, you're different from the others. That's very wise, she said this to him, and finished in, he said it was when she said to him, that's very wise, and I think you can do it even if she's at Windsor. He finally decided to give it a go. Okay, so you might want to dismiss people like this, right? There's like, okay, of course, you can always find, sorry, I've been told for years now, it is no longer politically correct to say crazy. But I think you mean it in a definitely offensive way right now if you use it this way, and you are probably all thinking it anyway. You probably are saying, quite offensively, there are always the crazy people. You can't exactly judge the use of technology off of the crazy people. Okay. So now I have one last example for you. This conference I just put on at my university, one of our keynotes was talking, and lovely talk, arguing AI is not person, don't mistake it as an actual interpersonal relationship that you're having. And he ended, but I think there's this really great use we might make of AI, and that's something like a nostalgia bot for people who are getting older. He felt he was getting near that stage. He thought it would be very nice to have some program that listened to him talk about his life. Okay. So it's not, I think it's not just people who might have like neglected to take their medications in the morning. I think it's like a wide range of people, right, who actually see, oh, you know, this might be a nice thing to have. And so I should caveat, maybe you're one of those people sitting there like, yeah, but you don't know what it's like to be alone all the time, right? So, yeah, I think it's actually a widespread thing, and it seems to be increasing. Okay, so, and I think we have a lot of TV shows that explore the negative uses of AI at an interpersonal level. Think Black Mirror, right? Every angle you could take to AI, Black Mirror has tried it, I think. I haven't watched the whole show. I struggled to get past the first episode. My husband finally talked me into moving on past that. I literally set it down for about, I don't know how long has it been around. Probably 5 years. I was like, that's it. So as a heads up, if you've never watched the show, don't watch the first episode. It's really dreadful and for no reason as far as I can see. But some of the sort of sci-fi shows that we have really sort of test out what we would find. And the suggestion is kind of, well, it wouldn't be as good as the real thing, I think is what most of the time we conclude. But I think we're also failing to ask ourselves, okay, yeah, granted, it wouldn't be as good as the real thing, but we often settle for things that aren't as good as the real thing. In fact, most of the time we settle for things that aren't as good. So the question then I think would be worth asking sort of, well, what are the motives and the reasons we have for why we engage with these kinds of programs in these sorts of ways? Sorry, I need some more water. All right, and I think you could talk about a lot of different motives, just piles. So I know some of the philosophers in the room are like, oh dear, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm picking two things. I hope you think of the rest of this talk very much as a sketch. Right? It needs filling out. It's not exhaustive. I'm going to use the wrong sort of qualifying language for it. So I want to look at two things. I think maybe there are at least these two things happening. I think the first is we kind of desire to see ourselves reflected back to us. Right? I think that's some of what's going on in these programs. And I think specifically in the case, like the example of the women who like these boyfriends who always say what they want to hear, I think it's kind of skipping the difficulty of a real relationship, right? Because it's a sort of well-established fact that real people don't always, in fact, sometimes never tell us what we want to hear, right? And actually real people don't always, in fact, sometimes they never admire us, right? They critique us, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, right? Real people sometimes leave us and fail to love us. So I think finding a real person to know us and then love us well is one of the most difficult parts of the human life. And I think this might be one of the things that we're happy to skip, or at least an enjoyable layer that we like to skip in a fantasy. I think maybe the only thing more difficult than finding someone who can do that for us, know us, see us, is actually become a person who can know and see people. Right? More on that later. The second sort of thing that I think might be happening, and I think is closely related to the first, is that most people suffer from profound loneliness. right? I mean, I think that's part of what they're marketing there, right? Is the easing of that, right? Even happy people with good relationships have a lot of loneliness. Never mind people who have sort of much more, well, without healthy relationships, right? In fact, some people become so lonely it becomes part of their pathology. So, and here I'm talking in sort of psychological language, right? So pathologies are beyond what the average person has, right? But it becomes a characteristic of a lot of pathologies. Loneliness does, right? And so I think that's part of what's going on when people escape into a fantasy is this, and I think they can combine, right? I'm not seeing them as utterly separate, right? So these two things, the desire to have yourself reflected back to you, and the desire to escape loneliness. I think these two things, I think we want someone, anyone, even if only our own self, and sometimes just a program that makes us feel like we've got something that can do those two things for us. Right? But here's what I find interesting about that. Between looking at the industry practices and sort of maybe considering some of the motives for it, we've essentially told the psychological version of a very old story, right? We've essentially told the story of Narcissus, right? I mean, maybe you saw that coming, I hope you did. I wasn't trying to keep it a secret or bury the lead, but, and I think most of us don't understand the story or the implications for ourselves. I think we kind of use the term as a slur, a very damning slur that we throw at people that are narcissists, so we don't have to deal with them, or we can treat them like they're not a person, kind of sideline them. And here we're usually talking about the pathology. Right? We're going to keep trying to distinguish these things, although I'm not too worried about the distinction. I'm going to make some offensive suggestions for all of us. But here's the thing, when you start to learn about the pathology of narcissism, there are a couple interesting things. I don't think most people would describe it this way. Right? A narcissist, the psyche of a narcissist is someone who has a gnawing sense of emptiness, loneliness, and an inability to know him or herself. Right? I think people just think of narcissism as self-absorption. Don't think they break it out into its actual psychological characteristics. Right? So there's this sort of fascination with the staring at oneself that's the result of not being able to know, right, another person, including one's own self. Right? And this sort of pathological loneliness of narcissism is the result, well, I'm not going to say, when I say this, I want to change the sentence now. So we're going to scrap that. We're going to do a redo. What do I want to say instead? I want to say that partly the loneliness involved in narcissism, right, is derived out of that space that this, you could almost think of it, you know, when we talk about kids not having object constancy until they're a certain age, is a little bit like that for a narcissist. They can't hold themselves or anyone else steady, and they can't retain who you are or who they are. So they have to constantly be going back and reminding themselves, or asking you to remind them, who am I? There's immense loneliness if you can never remember who you are or who the people around you are. So you always have to ask for the validation again and again and again, because you essentially live in this absolute empty space. I think if we demonized that pathology less, right? I don't mean think it's better than it is. I just mean not other it so much that we can't understand it. I think we'd actually sort of, well, we'd probably have more pity, but I think we'd also have more sort of lessons to learn for ourselves. Right? I think especially, I want to tie these two things together, right? I think in looking at that kind of pathology and these kinds of technologies, we see this need to know to be known, to be seen by others and ourselves, right? In some ways, I'm reiterating what I've already said. And in that knowing is a relief from the loneliness, right? I think in general, it's a human need. So I don't really think that we're just talking about religious persons or non-religious persons. I think like, if you're in the species, you probably got this going for you. And I also want to make clear, I'm not suggesting that we're all pathological narcissists. It's not what I'm suggesting at all. But I do think it comes on a scale. Right? So I think if you talk to psychologists, they will say there are scales, right? Not that everyone has the pathology of being a narcissist. That's a special kind of complex thing that we're not even going to try to touch. Right? Also, what I want to say in the next section, oh dear, I messed it up again. It does this thing where when I touch it, it jumps all over. Sorry, you'll have to bear with me for a minute. So I'm not suggesting that. I'm also not suggesting in the next section, when I say, oh, we should pity, we should understand, I'm not suggesting we indulge, right? So in the next section, when I start talking about what I think are some helpful things, I'm not suggesting that if you actually have a pathological narcissist in your life, that the real key and cure for this person is if you sat there and knew them their whole life. I think that would be to misunderstand the pathology entirely. We're not talking, I don't want to focus on the pathology of narcissism. I use it just as the extreme side of the thing I do want to talk about, right? We're not suggesting like sit and give endlessly, right? Because part of the pathology is it would literally suck your soul absolutely dry. I'm also not suggesting any of what follows in the next suggestion, in the next section is any kind of like cure, right? But I do think there are some interesting lessons we might draw out of this, right? So that's I want to go to the next section. This is my last section. I think I'm still doing okay on time. Lost my phone someplace between here and a restaurant, so I'm not 100% sure. Richard, I'm still okay on time? Good, okay. So I want to suggest that the increasing struggle with narcissism, and actually if you look at the data, it is an increasing struggle in our society. So it's not just like I pulled this example out of a hat. I think there's a reason the technology is also reflecting the pathology in certain ways. Okay? It seems to be an increasing struggle, right? And I actually want to suggest that it's the result of perverting one of our most precious capacities and gifts. So, I'll pause here again. You guys make me so nervous. It's all your fault. Psychologists would have something to say about that too. You're not supposed to outsource those things. Okay. So here's another older story, older than Narcissus, right? And I'm pretty sure that at least some of you know it, right? In his image he made us, male and female he made us, to know and be known, to stand face to face with the ultimate absolute knower. This is where the Christian tradition starts. Right? St. Augustine argued that every wrong love in this world is the distortion of some good. Right? And that all human desires, especially the terrible ones, are the desire for God taken in some way it ought not to be taken. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. I can't flesh out St. Augustine's philosophy. The Confessions alone would take us ages. But here are some examples of what he has in mind when he says it's a distortion of a good desire. So, for example, our desire for divine intimacy, he says it actually turns up as lust. So our desire for divine understanding turns up as pride. And our desire for the divine rest turns up as sloth. Okay. So he goes through, right? He goes through and sketches sort of a portrait of the brokenness around us, especially in our will and our loves, right? And he sort of gets followed by the whole Christian tradition. So I hope I haven't left orthodoxy with what I'm going to suggest next, because I'm just going to take that line of thinking and suggest that we have grasped, in this case, after knowing and being known, which is in fact one of the highest goods. It's actually held out as the promise of heaven. If you doubt me, look at 1 Corinthians 13:12, right? Now we see dimly as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Right? It is the promise of paradise to know and be known, to see another person in absolute raw intimacy and fullness. Right? Oh, and by the way, sorry, this is the nerd in me, can't help it. Actually, I probably could help it, but I'm not going to. That 1 Corinthians 13:12 verse is the key verse and framing verse for both Augustine's Confessions and Till We Have Faces. So if you've ever struggled to make sense out of those books, you need that verse. That verse is what they both are entirely trying to articulate and fill out. Okay. Sorry. Teacher lesson on something we're not really talking about right now. Okay. So I think in that, following in this sort of Augustine tradition and sort of every other theologian for thousands of years, the grasping after God's divine knowledge, I think, is part of why we fail to know ourselves and each other and God. I especially think that what we see in these sorts of technologies and tendencies in our society is the focus on being known, not on the knowing. Right? So maybe this is especially what amounts to the narcissistic pathology. It's the focus on being known. Can I just find somebody to know me? As opposed to whether or not I'm capable or have developed the skills to know a person. So I think that's where some of that slide comes from. The more you practice looking around the world to see who can know me, right? The less focus we have on actually developing the skills required to know somebody, right? And that becomes, if it's sort of fed and grown, it becomes very self-absorbed. Right? It also becomes very insular and lonely, right? For the same reason that most of us probably don't find a person who is uninterested in us very interesting. Okay, you flip that round. If we're only interested in ourselves, we're not that interesting to other people. So this is a sort of feeds a monster, and I think I suppose part of what I'm saying here is it comes at the cost of becoming selfless persons. It's almost directly at odds with it, and this self-absorption, I suppose, leads to, or I'm suggesting, is what leads to a lot of this loneliness and the suffering. Right? Or as Augustine would say, we make of ourselves a wasteland, right? I think, I'm going to switch a little bit. So I've suggested that Christians stand to gain much by following in the footsteps of this tradition that sort of asks, what is it that we really love, instead of focusing on what is the technology and how are we using it, but rather what are the motives and what's going on behind the scenes. And also in that tradition that what we love is always a grasping after God, right? Not always in a good way. So I think we can gain. I'm gonna list 3 things. This first one's a little weird because then I listed 3 things in it, so you're gonna get lost along the way. But it's one thing that we gain. I think we gain compassion and understanding about human feelings, our own and others. Okay, so I don't want you to mistake the harshness of the picture that I'm drawing as hopeless or without mercy. So I think here are the things that I think we come to understand. The 3 things. Right? I think it suggests that people do love good things, and that's actually a hopeful thing, I think, to recognize. We oftentimes just focus on the terribleness of what they love instead of recognizing that, in fact, they are loving a good thing in a wrong way. Right? So I think that's one important understanding we could gain. I think it also suggests that we suffer profound hells for our misplaced loves and misguided loves. Right? And I think that's another space for pity for ourselves and for other people. And I think it also suggests that probably none of us escape some level of this or some degree of it. We're all probably struggle at some level with some of this kind of brokenness, I suppose. And I think there is a mercy, a very severe mercy in it. Right? I think to know what we are and what ails us is a mercy. It's not a pleasant one, but it is, I think, nonetheless hopeful. The second thing I think we gain is a better sense of what the problem is. Instead of wringing our hands in fear, why do people use these technologies? Why is the world becoming more narcissistic? I think that it gives us some traction for talking to each other, the world around us. Here's the problems that we see. Here's how we think it's playing out at these various levels of technological use, of sort of interpersonal failings. So I think instead of just condemning men and women and their uses of AI, I think we can find roots for the afflictions and the problems, and I think that's really helpful. I think we might even find also prescriptive layers as we grow in understanding. So instead of just thinking of AI as a problem for legislation or programmers, which is often how it seems like, oh my gosh, we got to legislate against this thing. Programmers need to build in controls at this level. Instead of looking at it that way, I think maybe we could actually start to see that these are old problems. They're not the kinds of problems you can legislate out of existence. They're the problems that humans have always struggled with, when they've struggled to have interpersonal relationships, when they've struggled to use their own creations well. So it's the age-old problem that you always have to face, and you can't just sort of turn to law to get rid of it, right? Or regulations to get rid of it. I think, sorry, gotta get another drink. I think also it provides some suggestions for how we might ease our pain and other people's pain. I think it actually, I want to suggest it lies in the other half. I've already kind of suggested it, so it's not like it's a surprise. Philosophers don't do mystery novels. I had a graduate professor tell me that one time. Never write a philosopher a mystery paper. They don't want to know at the end what you were planning to argue. They want to know at the very beginning. So hopefully you already kind of know where I'm going with this. I think part of the resolution to this lies in the other half of that verse, right? That 1 Corinthians 13:12 verse, in the knowing half. And we always love the being known part, right? You talk to people about their desires for a romantic relationship. We usually emphasize that somebody who can see me, somebody who can know me. But we don't always turn it around and think, well, maybe some of the struggles that I face are tied into the kind of knower I am. Or maybe we don't always ask ourselves, do I aspire to know people? Right? I aspire to be known, but do I aspire to know people? And so I'm suggesting, I suppose, that the knowing and seeing others is part of the resolution to our loneliness. And this isn't, again, not original to me. I'm suggesting it because I package these ideas all together, but not because it's mine. So Roger Scruton is a contemporary philosopher. He's dead, but contemporary. Well, I don't know why. I feel like when you say contemporary, it suggests that you will go find this person alive. He's dead. But just recently dead. So, sorry. I've really tried to clean up my act tonight. My students know I'm famous for really dark examples. I've been really trying hard, but it still comes out wrong. Anyway, he's also an Anglican, or was an Anglican. And he argued in the face of God, that's the book that he argued this in, that loving is the active giving of the self, which is a form of willing sacrifice and suffering on behalf of others, most especially God. Sorry, I did it again. Sheesh. Okay. So he suggests that every self is a bit self-alienated, so that this is the struggle, internal struggle, right? The suffering soul that cannot quite square with itself, so to speak. That's not his language. That's my contractor daughter upbringing there. Sorry. And so he suggests that it's he argues that healing happens precisely through the willing the suffering and the sacrifice involved specifically in loving persons. And so his idea here is that it's the choosing to sacrifice our will predominantly and foremost to God's, right? So he's not saying like run around and sacrifice your will to every awful person who wants you to do an awful thing. Not that kind of sacrificing your will. Okay? But sacrificing what you want for what somebody else wants is one of these characteristic things required of loving. Okay? And I mean, you could see it in petty things too, right? It's like, I didn't want to watch that movie, but I did it anyway kind of thing. But at a much more substantial level in life, in knowing persons romantically or otherwise, right? In friendships, in communities, right? And he suggests this is actually how we come to more fully participate and reflect the image of God. So he has in mind the garden moment, Christ in the garden, right? And choosing, right, God's will over his own. Not my will, but thine. In contrast to Adam and Eve, who refused to yield their will to God's. Right? And notice, nice little circle here that we do, Narcissus is also set in a garden. Narcissus, by contrast, symbolizes the will or the soul that cannot meet God or others or its own self, actually, through a sort of extreme and absolute refusal to sacrifice the self at all. Right? For anyone, right? Won't yield the will, won't in any way let go of what he wants for the sake of anything, right? To his own sort of death and detriment. So Scruton suggests that what we're made for is to sacrifice. This is not the kind of sacrifice that you might think happens because the world is imperfect. I think sometimes people only think of sacrifice as the thing that needs to happen because the world is dreadful and not as it should be. But actually part of what Scruton is talking about is a redeemed sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice that would make it into paradise, if paradise were a place where you still loved anyone besides yourself. So it'd be a kind of sacrifice that would have to have an eternal quality to it, because always Christ is surrendering and sacrificing his will to the Father's. Right? So this is not a temporary broken world kind of sacrifice. This is the resolution to loneliness at an eternal level. So I suppose maybe I'll just recap, right? So that what I think where we sort of use each other, or the things we have made to serve our own reflections, as it were, to mirror back our own fantasies about ourselves. There also we find this loneliness that's absolutely unbearable, and unbearable just because it's this sort of ultimate isolation from others, and an isolation that is the result of not yielding ourselves to anyone at all. Right? And so I guess what I sort of aimed tonight to do was to suggest to you that the uses and misuses and mistakes we make in technology are better viewed as symptoms than the problems. So I think if we're wise, we'll probably ask, what are the problems, what are the causes, and worry most about correcting the root problems as opposed to addressing the symptoms. And I think if we do that, then maybe it's hopeful, but maybe we'll finally understand and be able to say with St. Augustine, love God and do what you will. And I think I'm going to stop there. I think I've gone over now by a bit, so I'm going to stop and take questions from you. Thank you. Yes.
Do you think there's a causation relationship between the rise in AI technology and the rise in narcissism? Do you think that?
Well, it does seem. I don't know. So here's the problem with the Q&A with the philosopher, because then all the hedging comes right back and we do nothing useful. But I think I'm not sure if I want to say causation. Maybe, but if there were causation, I suppose I would think it's more we produce tools to service what we want. So I don't think that the tool was narcissistic and so we became more narcissistic. I think we had needs and desires and created the tools to satisfy them.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking as a mom of 4 kids who are now being raised in a world saturated this way.
Okay, so could it finally be
more of because there's all candy, that they're constantly eating that candy, and then they're developing these diseases because of that.
Well,
I'm wondering, is there that happening because it's started at such a young age that it's now?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think partly we would want to defer to the psychologists. I think pathological narcissism is usually developed through a variety of ways. I think there's conflicting studies on it, but it seems like a lot of times psychologists will tell you that it actually has to do with the parent-child relationship, where parents never were present enough to reflect to their children themselves. The children never learn how to see or be seen. So I think the pathology is a little different. But I do hear what you're saying. There's this other kind of problem, like could it inadvertently, secondhand narcissism start spreading kind of thing.
Well, I read The Anxious Generation, and so I'm coming from that.
I mean, and so in that sense, I think there are lots of ways we check out and we no longer train people how to be selfless. I think but I do think that's an old problem. I think maybe we see a certain display of how to be self-absorbed with our technology that we wouldn't have seen 1,000 years ago, but I think we would have seen the same self-absorption, just located in a different activity. So in that sense, I think, I want to say yes in the sense that I think always we have to be aware of the degree to which we are just sort of little monsters running around looking for a mirror. I think that does happen, right? And I do think that's just something that always, if we're not paying attention. There's this great talk by David Foster Wallace. He gave a commencement speech called "This is Water." And his suggestion in it was the hardest thing to see is our own self-absorption. And so in that sense, I think it is the work of a lifetime to become less self-absorbed. I don't know if that's quite good. Yes, Kelly.
Sorry, there's like 20 things I want to tie together, and one of them was going to be David Foster Wallace. So,
It's a very good talk. I make all my interests.
There's this thinker, Matthew Crawford, who talks about narcissism in a similar chapter. The same chapter he talks about David Foster Wallace in this speech, and he gives a sort of Freudian analysis on narcissism, where he talks about it as a sort of fragility of the ego. And how what the narcissist does is it seeks to make things in the world and other people sort of artificial limbs to prop up themselves. And so I think, and this goes with the Jonathan Haidt stuff as well. So I'm curious if you could just comment on thoughts of maybe the modern narcissism is less this sort of self-absorption, but more this fragility, and we're becoming more and more fragile people, perhaps because of the ubiquity of technology. So this sort of, well, when I was a kid, I had to walk up the hill in snow both ways to get to school. And there's something interesting about how like we can always say that, but so we just dismiss it. But in some sense, it's also true because each generation gets the new technology to solve the problems that are there. And so we don't need to invent a technology to solve the problem that was solved 50 years ago. Now we're making new. So each generation, there is a sense in which we do have more technology to solve problems that aren't there. So we just, in some sense, things are easier. And so and if we're less interpersonal, and so there's just less and less demands made on us by other people. And so if this is a sort of, we finally don't have people making demands on us, and so and we're lonely, we're bowling alone, right? And so now we just use technology, AI, to fill in that hole. And the thing is, it's just going to become a deeper perversion because it gives us the person we want. Does that sound?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm this annoyingly stubborn I have this annoyingly stubborn tendency to resist outsourcing what we face to the people or the world around us. So I'm a little bit resistant to thinking It could be that our technology increases our tendencies. I think I'm a little resistant to that thought because it's not clear to me that you go to any era in the human history and find a radically different level of the problem, either in the positive or the negative. So that leads me to kind of think it's probably not the technology that's causing. Now, can we create technology that is a rabbit hole? Yeah, but then I would just say that causally it's us driving ourselves down the technological hole. Now, that was one part of what you said, and I'll let you, if you want to push back on that, come back to it. But the other half was you were talking about fragility in the ego. I think I've said enough to you all that I'm not a psychologist. My understanding, so we'd have to go talk to them and defer to them. My understanding is actually the fragility has always been there in every iteration of narcissism in every age. And the fragility is born of the fear of the dark, of the emptiness, of the nobody there. So every narcissist in every age is afraid, is fragile in that way, because to tear down the carefully constructed public self is to destroy the only self they've got. So if you ruin that, now their emptiness is public to the whole world and themselves for a moment, and then it gets quickly built right back up. And then fragility is a fear. Did you want to respond to that? Because I said a bunch of things that I might not have understood.
I totally agree. I think the human condition is the human condition. But I guess one way of thinking about it is think about the there's more obesity nowadays than there ever has been. And we say, well, look, that's not a human change, that's a sort of material conditions change. We just have more food than ever we have. So I think
fewer animals chasing us.
Yeah, and so we can say sort of, well, that's a technology thing. So I think a similar thing, yes, the human conditions hasn't changed. If you gave someone in the 1300s 6,000 calories a day, they're going to get just as fat as we are now. But so I think the less the specifics of the technology, but the ubiquity. So I think the sort of material conditions throughout history would have been such that, for all practical purposes, the world's going to be telling you no a lot. Versus nowadays, because of the saturation of technology, the world just doesn't push back on you. Like, so if I was growing up.
Right, but so I guess that's where I'm going to say again, I think that's a focus on the symptom, right? Yes. If I have this technology, can we all indulge the worst part of ourselves? Sure, but I think again, that's the symptom side of it. Were we always gluttons who would eat ourselves into obesity? Probably. Yeah. Right, and we have eras where they had the option, and that seems to have happened again. So I guess my thought is, if I'm self-absorbed, or if that's a major characteristic, then yes, I could talk about the ubiquity of the technology that encourages me towards it. Now it's very easy to be my worst self. Okay, but I'm not sure that says very much that's helpful to me about me, outside of just that now I know how awful I will choose to be if you put it at my fingertips. So I guess that's why I resist the outsourcing or the focus on the symptoms, because I think it's not so helpful to us to say, if I lived in an era where I didn't have so many options, I'd have been a better person. You might have looked like a better person. You wouldn't have been a better person. You still would have been wanting to do the same set of things. You just had fewer resources for doing them. I know the Aristotelian is probably not happy with that, because he wouldn't have been practicing the terrible things.
Oh, well.
Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I'm sure get that, but I think the occasions for developing excellence would have been more pronounced.
Oh, no, you could argue that if at my fingertips are more opportunities to be terrible now, then I have more opportunities to be a good person now than ever before.
Well, I'm thinking maybe more like if I had more siblings. If I just grew up in a house where I had 4 or 5 siblings and we all shared a room, I would have to learn how to be selfless, or else I'm just going to perish. But nowadays, if I'm in a household with 1 or 2 kids and we both got our own 20-foot by 20-foot bedroom with our own iPad and our own,
yeah, that's an interesting question about option. I don't know. I'm inclined to think, the location of the opportunities would shift, but maybe in some ways where you have the opportunity to be terrible, you also have that many more opportunities to not be terrible. Yes, go ahead.
So I have 9 younger siblings.
Oh. Were you a lot less selfish?
So I was good. I'm just going to say I think there are lots of opportunities to not be selfish. but you could also choose to just be selfish and just have to endure. So I don't think that.
Then you can have your own fiefdom, right?
Yeah. So I think the opportunities that require you to not be selfish are beneficial, but only if you take them up. You don't have to use them. Yeah.
Sorry, Dr. Wallet?
Well, we didn't remember her name.
Yeah. Sorry, I skipped over you, but yeah, go ahead.
No, so how do you know my name?
I was in the graduate program right as you were leaving it.
Okay, all right. Well, then you also know Freddie Schumann.
No, maybe that was just a bit more before my time.
No, he was, or he came after, he was a philosopher of law. I want to commemorate him
Okay.
on the occasion, because you're bringing up the sentencing example.
Yes.
And Freddie Schumann's, one of his most famous article was on incapacitating the dangerous. And his argument was, and we can use AI, if you were to use AI with regards to the practice of quarantining the dangerously ill, right? We claim we're totally justified in doing that. We claim also, now maybe also through using artificial intelligence, that we're getting better and better at predicting who would be dangerous and then who would be subject to quarantine.
Yeah.
The person that would be quarantined, not saying they're responsible for being dangerous, but simply from the fact of being dangerous would be quarantined. And Freddie argued you can do the same thing with regards to prisons, right? If you could sufficiently, with accuracy, predict that the persons would be dangerous, then you have the justification socially to incapacitate them. And so what do you think about that as an argument? And if it all goes through, isn't your qualm with it just the whole idea of incapacitating the dangerous and not seeking retributive justice?
Yeah,
because
so-
it sort of seemed that was the case.
Yeah, so on the one hand, I would notice that was just an example. That's definitely not what I'm talking about. And I'm not really going to die on that hill. But I do think it's one that raises concerns, right?
Yeah.
So as you pointed out, it's a long debate, right? And
Yeah.
some of you, I don't know, it's an old movie now. And what? Minority Report. Minority Report is like the quintessential version of that in sci-fi, where we lock up everyone if we sort of are able to predict their premeditated thoughts, but stop them before they do. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. I have worries about it, but I definitely don't want to lead you or anyone else to thinking that I'm actually trying to make a case about that. I just use it as an example where it raises a lot of worries we might have about the justice of punishing people before they've done something, even if the effect is that we have a safer society. In fact, if we off everybody, we'd have a really safe society. I don't know, it's a story. Oh, good. There's a bunch of hands here too. I'll take yours and then I'll go. Yeah, oh, sorry, did I not
No,
let you finish?
it's coming back. I have a second question.
Okay, yes.
I'm trying to tie this together, but I'm thinking about the relationship between AI and sanctification and edification. And it's just something that, because it seems to me that so much of our sanctification is meant to get worked out through relationship. First upward towards God, and then secondly outwards towards other people. And yet the inherent bent of not even just AI, but also most digital technologies is inward and downwards. As Martin Luther would say, curved in towards ourselves. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that. I'm also, I had a second part to that. Well, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think there's a lot that could be said there, and so I'll probably not say as much as I'd like to, or even as much as I should in the bit of time I have. I think on the one hand, I think there are good uses to technology. As much as most people know me to be somebody who's quite reticent about technology, I mean, if you know me very much at all, I have like 0 social media platforms. You can get me by email and phone number when I find that phone. Yeah, like I really lost it this time. So on the one hand, yes, I see some of the ways. I think sometimes when we use social medias and we use AI programs, it's easy to lose track of persons as persons. Right? So I think there are a lot of dangers there, but I also think there are a lot of good things that come out of this space. Right? So again, I think sanctification comes precisely in the space where we misbehave. Right? Where we have this question, why did I misbehave and how ought I to have done differently. I think that's where the challenge shows up. So sometimes, as much as I hate technology for a variety of reasons, I'm not sure the right reason to hate it is that we see our worst self in it. I think that might be a reason to start worrying or thinking or considering how we use it, right? And I'm not suggesting we keep on using it that way, I guess, but I think maybe we should resist the knee-jerk reaction to think like, I would be, and maybe you weren't saying this. You said something very briefly, and I just spin off into all sorts of directions. I do resist the idea that sanctification would occur more if I weren't engaging with these technologies.
Well, and you made me think of the second part of my question. At what point is the language of technology no longer applicable in this context? Because I often hear the conversations around AI, digital technology, the Internet of Things, as this is another tool. It's a tool that's as neutral as the development of the wheel and the hammer and the scythe and everything else. But the wheel and the hammer, the wheel and the hammer and the scythe were not developed by companies who have a specific aim to make money off of the capitalization of attention. And so it seems that to label them as somehow morally neutral that lies in the hands of the user isn't an entirely fair definition of this new category.
Right, like you might sell drugs to all sorts of people because they want it, and that doesn't make you a great person. It also doesn't mean that their addiction is your fault. Here, I guess part of my resistance to that is, you probably don't want to say much about the sort of moral quality of people developing technologies. That's a different question. But the fact that they're developing and selling because you want something also reflects badly on the wanting. Right? So I don't really want to get into a huge argument with everybody about whether or not you should sell something that's terrible. I think it's actually really hard to figure out how to prevent people from selling bad things to others, especially when you discover the really creative ways people have of using seemingly innocuous things for really terrible ends. So I want to maybe stay out of that. I think it's complicated. I think there's a lot to be said there. I think that for you and I, in our everyday lives, we're better served asking ourselves, but why did I want it? Why did I buy it? Why did I feed it? Why did I develop it in myself? I think there are other layers to talk about for sure, but I'm not sure it serves us best in our daily lives to worry so much about the horrible person selling it as it does to ask ourselves, why did I buy it? Why did I engage in it? I guess that's my initial thought. There's, like I said, a lot more to be said there, and I would have to nuance my philosophy of like economics and all kinds of things into that space a little more.
Maybe one more.
Two more? There were two people back here, so let's go with the two of you. Sorry to the rest of you if you were about to throw up your hand or already did.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm trying to form this into a question, but I'm really excited for you to sit on, but whatever. Sure. I'm thinking about the distinction with saying our desire is that we want to be known, but it seems to me that we want to be known and loved, not known and hated. Like, I'm scared to death of being known truly and then rejected. But what I really want is to be known and accepted. And I'm wondering if that actually has to happen before I have the trust to be self-sacrificial towards others. Like, there's a big risk in giving up my will for another. And so I need to be known and then have a place of trust. And I'm wondering if AI, the reason it's being used by many is because it sort of pacifies that sense of being known and accepted. It tells me everything I want to hear. And maybe it doesn't make me worse. Like it's something I use because I already have this messed up inside. But maybe it holds me there because it doesn't allow me to go into a relationship, to take the risk of being known and loved. That would actually free me up. So it's not just being trained in being self-sacrificial, but I actually is it, and I'm asking this, I'm not
Yes. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that I actually have to be given a safe place to be self-sacrificial in some way?
When you said this, very nice sort of question in space that you're articulating, my brain went like 10 directions.
I know.
And no, it's not your fault, actually. I'm going to say a line of things, and I'm not sure they're going to tie together. Sorry. And so I'm just going to say them, and maybe you'll make sense out of them. Maybe you'll be like, see, obviously philosophers contradict themselves. Like it happens, so we'll see. We'll see what happens in the next few minutes. And I might ask you to re-say a couple of the things you said, because my mind did go in like 3 directions. So on the one hand, I hear this kind of question that Augustine asks at the beginning of the Confessions. How do I know you? Do you have to first call on me, or do I call on you? I think that's a kind of metaphysical question that I don't want to answer. I don't want to answer because I'm not sure I can answer it. I think part of his answer has to do with the image of God in the human self. So that there is a kind of calling that you and I, if we weren't religious, might not recognize as God calling. There's a framework of knowing truth. So the being known and being seen becomes a very metaphysically complicated thing for somebody like Augustine. And indeed, I think maybe for most of the great metaphysical Christians. So I'm going to bracket that. I'm not quite sure what to say about that. And that's part of, I take it, what you're after. Do I first have to know God in order, and be known by him, I guess, in order to sacrifice myself or my will to him or to anyone else? I actually think that Augustine and following in the Platonic tradition might say anytime you endorse truth, it is a kind of surrender of your will to God. It might be a tiny step, but anytime you choose truth over a lie, even if it's just at the sort of observation of nature or beauty in the world, it's a kind of surrender of the self. So in that sense, it might not be as far out of grasp as people think. But then I'm also hearing this other thing that you're suggesting, like I have to feel safe and seen. I'm not so sure about that. Because we want people to endorse the most terrible things about us, but I think if you go into the Orthodox tradition, and by Orthodox I mean little o, not Eastern Orthodox, I just mean all Orthodox theology, you actually find something different. The experience of God's hatred is just the experience of what is unacceptable in you before God. So it's a loving God that you experience as hating you. And I'm not sure human love would be so different. If you're terrible to me, I'm not sure my best love wouldn't feel like hatred to you. And it would have to be good love, because it couldn't endorse what is dreadful in you. So I think it might actually not be a safe space that we need in order to first sacrifice and suffer on behalf of others, but rather the letting go of the self I hold so dear. And sometimes it is my most terrible self that I hold most dear. My miserable self that I want somebody to say, isn't that beautiful? And so I guess I'm inclined to think, no, if we look for safe spaces, that is our self-absorbed ego screaming from the rooftops, endorse my dreadful self. And I'm not sure that would be good for us. So I guess those are 3 directions my brain went. And I'd like to ask you for a follow-up, but I've already been told maybe 2. So, yes, go ahead.
Wrong question to Elizabeth. I mean, I was reflecting back at the beginning of it, and I thinking exactly as a relationship between narcissism and artificial intelligence and thought. And I kind of thought back to some of the earlier things that you said, and the way that I can reconstruct it is something like, superficially it looks like the connection between narcissism and AI is basically like, it looks like we're making versions of ourselves that are artificial, right? And so it sort of looks like looking at ourselves in the mirror in that way, the narcissus. And more broadly, then you go from there and saying like there's this thing where all we're essentially we're lonely, and this kind of psychology of loneliness as sort of the root of narcissism. And I think it seems like in a way, and that's why you brought in the kind of the deadly sins, right? The sins as the sort of perversions of love. So it seems like in a way, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but in a way what you're doing, if I'm correct in this, your talk is something like you're talking about all of the aspects of our typical human psychology. There may be in modern capitalist countries, or exactly it is typical modern human psychology that is sort of there waiting for AI to grow on top of it, like, like a grotesque. And I think you were talking about gluttony, and I thought, it might be that we all have the tendency toward gluttony, but it's only when there's the possibility of eating lots and lots of cakes that like it actually sort of turns into kind of a fantastic scene of gluttony, like you see in some Renaissance paintings, right? And so it might be that AI is just kind of like the glove that what you're looking at as the hand that is inside the glove, like the hand is what is the glove is made to fit around it, and AI is the sort of grotesque that is made to fit around like a certain form of kind of reverse psychology. It happens to sort of like hypertrophically grown in capitalist society, or at least what the person over there said a few minutes ago. Like it's not just a tool, it sort of turns into this kind of like aggressive tool that is marketed toward our things. So I find on one hand, like I learned a lot about thinking about what it is about us that might, give rise to this particular form of technology today. But I'd love to get into also wondering, like, is there something we are learning to do from this about AI itself? I don't know what exactly the answer is, and that's not what you're trying to do. But I think it's like, maybe the answer is something like, there are lots of directions this could go. Now, futurology is an awful science, it's just out of the 70s, right? We shouldn't bring it back, But so, you're not here to try to predict the actual future of AI, but maybe the answer there is something like, if there are these other kinds of perversions, like whether it's lust or gluttony, sloth would be a strange one, I suppose, but some of them seem like sort of aggressive perversions, right? The gluttony and rage both have in common that they're kind of giving into excess, So addictions, like they kind of like we want more, we can get them more and more, we do more and more of them. But then there are very passive sins like sloth, for example, that seem very different from that. So I don't know, I feel like although your focus is on the human psychology, I feel like I'm learning something sort of imaginative about the direction of AI. I think that if we think of it as sort of building around these human weaknesses, then we can kind of imagine what shape it might take.
Good. Yes, and thank you so much for saying that, because that's actually more what I was thinking. If we pause to really take stock and root ourselves in these older traditions of thought and psychology and philosophy and theology, then we leave up to not me to say prescriptively, here's how we should respond, but rather an audience or a sort of community to go, okay, given these things, now how do we think? Because I doubt any one person's going to come up with a response to AI at all these levels. So yes, I'm actually really glad to hear you summarize it in that way, because that's what I'm hoping for, is that people leave not so much saying, she said, here's how we should respond to AI, but here are things to consider when we respond to AI. So yes, thank you. I think that's exactly what I'm hoping for. Yeah.